I want to introduce our speaker, Brandon Belcher. He right now he works at the works as the North Texas Preserves Manager with the Nature Conservancy, and he's also, I believe, in charge of the Climber Preserve. It's just one of the areas that you're in charge of. Is that right? Yeah, you got that right. And let's see, I have here. I want to thank this month's sponsor for the program is Pat Bowman. And Brandon has been, let's see, he received his Bachelor of Science in Wildlife and Conservation Science and an MS in Biology, Plant Ecology from Texas A&M University over in Commerce. And he also serves over there as an adjunct instructor as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Brandon.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, I forgot. I do have one. And you just, it's these two bottom ones on the left.
I'm sure I'll do that. Well, thank you all for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. As you said, I work in conservation directly. My focus is in the Blackland Prairie ecoregion, so I oversee a handful of different sites owned by the Nature Conservancy, but also work on partner lands in many different capacities, from full management to an advisory component to different types of assist and on-the-ground work. But we've got quite a few folks that are focused on prairie remnants in this region. That's what I'll be talking about today. But I want to give some background to that to get us started. Maybe there we go. Okay, so talking about grasslands globally, we recognize that they're through the temperate regions of the different continents. In general, we're going to see these dominated by grasses and forbs and then graduating into some shrubs. But as these areas become woodlands, we no longer perceive them to be grasslands. The climate for these areas across the board is going to be semi-humid, semi-arid, dependent upon the region of the world, but they're going to be moderate in temperature across the board. So there are a number of different words that apply to grasslands. I usually like to get the housekeeping out of the way. When I use the word prairie today, what I'm referring to specifically are those remnants, those unplowed tracts of land that are set aside for one reason or another, and I'll touch on that, but those spaces that are remaining in the original or intact condition, specifically the native grasslands to the different regions. So some of the different words that we see that apply to grasslands include rangeland. We talk about cropland. We use the word pasture or old agricultural fields, and I'll use some of those today, I'm sure. But when I use the word prairie, I specifically mean these unplowed spaces. One of the words that I hear most frequently is weeds, and that frequently comes from the folks that have been in the region for a long time and look at land as an economic stimulant, a way in which to make a living. And for many of the families that have been at the farming for so many years, they either see crops as their agricultural production, or they're looking at specifically hay, and in that they typically don't like to see the biodiversity, the wide variety of species for which I'm typically working. So weeds is something that comes up with some frequency. The prairies, these unplowed, native, natural areas are incredibly rare. At this point, for the ecoregion that once spanned 12 million acres, we're looking at far less than 1% being in this unplowed condition. So when we see these things, it can be difficult to identify them at times. Most of them have been mapped and sussed out, and the conditions are relatively known. But when we see them, we're looking at an incredibly rare ecosystem to be intact and functioning as it is. A lot of the pictures today come from the Climber Meadow Preserve, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. The North American grasslands, spanning kind of the greenish section through the central part of the United States, is quite broad. We know that we have a number of different climate-driven ecosystems, driven also in part, or designated in part by topography, things like the Appalachian Mountains or the Rocky Mountains to the west. These make tremendous differences, but much of it is climate-driven. However, when we start to get into those, we're going to see many more details when we look at it up close. The formation of these grasslands across the continent is generally led by the changes in climate about 12,000 years ago. Between 18 and 12,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age was upon us. This was at the end of the Pleistocene era. The Wisconsin glaciation was the name of that era, or that actual glaciation, but that Laurentide ice sheet, kind of the large piece that we see on the right, began to recede between 18,000 and 12,000 years ago, and this was followed by what we refer to as the hypsothermal drought. That was between 12 and 8,000 years ago. And that drought was a rapid warming and drying of our climate across the continent. This led to big change from what was essentially wet and cool forest across much of the continent to the drier and warmer conditions that we see today. And with that change, especially in precipitation, the grasslands began to form as we know them today. So we break apart prairies and talk about them, grasslands at large, in several different ways. One is looking at the height of the grass, and running from east to west, we have a gradation in precipitation, and that drives plant height. So as we move from the east, where things are wetter, towards the west, we go from tall grasses into mid grasses, and then further out to the west into short grasses. And if you've driven across Texas from east to west, you can see these changes. Further, though, we can break these apart into moisture conditions, and these can be done locally, not just across a region, but even within a region. So here in Hunt County, we can find spaces that are going to fit each of these criteria, not just on a daily or weekly, monthly, seasonal basis, but rather for long periods. So wet prairies can be found along the Sabine River, for example. And there's a little bit of that left. There are some examples, but adjacent to some of the really wet areas, those spaces that are seasonally flooded, but where the soil stays saturated for long periods of time, we see plants that are adapted to those wet conditions. Mesic, kind of that in-between space, we can find those. Typically, of course, full sun is a driving factor, but soil-dependent conditions where moisture stays in the soil for longer periods of time, dependent upon the soil texture or the porosity of it. And then dry, those upland areas that are absolutely most exposed to the sun, perhaps to the wind, gives a drying effect, and again, the soils can be driving factors in this. Okay, when we look at the tallgrass prairies, as we get closer into these maps and these systems, we see that everybody's drawn them differently, and so I caution against taking any one of these maps as any sort of gospel for where exactly parameters and boundaries might be found, but tallgrass prairies looks much more like this. So we can see that it doesn't fit the exact scheme as I showed in the last couple slides with the region of the Great Plains throughout the central portion of the United States. We can also see, though, that we've got tallgrass prairies stretching out to the east into areas that were otherwise designated as forests, and further in Texas all the way down along the coastal plain, the true coastal plain. All right, so our blackland prairie ecoregion, yet another map to break this apart. On the left is one of the Gould divisions. These are used by Texas Parks and Wildlife, which is where this map has come from. It's showing the blackland prairie with the main belt, again about 12 million acres. When we include the prairie pieces that are down to the bottom right, we've got the Fayette and the San Antonio prairie, maybe a bit hard to see. Those are still considered to be blackland prairie based on the soil present, and then the plant communities that derive from the soil in combination with the climate. But then along the coast, we have the coastal prairies and marshes, which again are a completely different system. The tall grasses are present. We see many of the same species, but the soil, the moisture, and then the salinity as a component make these a very different system overall. So when we look at the blackland prairie ecoregion with a very simplistic map, we see it stretching from the Red River, or near the Red River, all the way down to San Antonio in kind of this narrowing belt. In the center of that, there's quite a bit of rock near the surface, the limestone. So those escarpments, or those exposed or nearly exposed soils allow for easy travel, and that's how cities, including Dallas and then down to Waco, Austin and San Antonio, were built. I-35 following those, it makes an easy travel even now. But if you can imagine doing that in one of the wagons or on horseback or even on foot, how difficult it may be with some of the soils, we can see why that would have been. In this region, we see, as I said, 12 to 15 million acres. We have a elevation 300 to 800 generally, feet above sea level, of course, and then we're looking at 30 to 40 inches of rain on average, and that's going to be a long-term average. But as we know, in recent years, those numbers are all over the board, and so it's kind of hard to look at that as too seriously. But as I said a few minutes ago, between 12 and 8,000 years ago is the formation of these grasslands. And so we think of them perhaps, at least those intact prairie pieces of them, as being old growth. And this is the idea that they've essentially been unchanged for all of that time. And it brings about a different viewpoint perhaps on the rarity of these, not just that they're uncommon now, but this is something that has been in place and generally functioning as we see it for this many years, for perhaps 10,000 years, even more than that. We've got three major soil orders across the ecoregion. On the western side, we see mollisols, which are a sandy soil, have a bit of a rock component to them. Moderate fertility, but with that fertility, they actually are the most common soil order up through the Great Plains, up through the breadbasket, or the Midwestern portion of the United States, and we all understand agricultural production for that region. So moderate productivity is a relative thing. They are super productive, even amongst themselves. On the far eastern side, we see alpha salts. These are a particularly sandy soil. They have a higher pH. It's going to be below 7. So they're actually an acidic soil, but overall lowest fertility. So that's going to be as we're coming out of the post-oak savanna and into the blackland prairie ecoregion. Of course, in the map, we see kind of dotted space here, and as always, when we get in closer and begin to look at the details by, say, a county level or even smaller, more close-up than that, we're going to see a lot of variation across this region. The vertisol, though, these are the soils that give the blackland prairie its name. These are those dark, rich, very sticky, heavy clay soils that we're also familiar with. They're particularly obvious throughout this region. Here in Hunt County, primarily vertisol soil. So this is known by many different names, known as a gumbo soil. It's a very thick and sticky. It can be hard to work. Sometimes, I'm told a century back, it was called a nooner soil, simply because in the morning it was too wet and heavy and sticky to work, and by the afternoon it was too dry and hard to work. And so just catching it right in the middle was the right time to get things started. But thinking backwards through the different technologies, beginning to plow this space must have been incredibly difficult. A single animal and a single furrow plow working through the soil. But even beyond that, it is still very difficult to do much of anything, regardless of what technology we're using today. When the ground is hard and dry, typically in the dry summer season here, it can be very difficult to work even with small machinery. Things, tractors and front loaders can be challenged by this. Very heavy soils, but also very, very fertile. And of course, that led to agricultural production through the region. I'll touch on that. But I want to point out two words on the screen, or three words. The Mima mounds under the alpha sol. These are sometimes called pimple mounds. And then gilgai under the vertisol. So each of these are going to be referred to as microtopography. These are small changes in the surface of the soil, and they result from different actions. The Mima mounds are typically found on the alpha sols. There are some in the mollisols, but they're much more pronounced on those alpha sol soils, so typically to the east of here. And they can be visible if you take I-30 out towards Texarkana, both sides of the highway as you get farther out. I don't know, as you're approaching New Boston, for example, on both sides of the highway, in large pastures, we can see these repeated kind of lumps or high points. They almost look like a golf course that's been abandoned and is now supporting livestock. But the other microtopography, gilgai, it's an Australian word. It actually translates, an Aboriginal word that translates into small pool of water. I like to joke that it actually means to trip, because what we have, or what you see in this image, these small depressions across the surface of the soil, they result from soil movement, and the way that it works is really unique. The vertisol soils are characterized by a particular type of clay that has a huge expansion rate. It has the ability to more than double in size. So when it's wet, it swells, and when it dries, that means it contracts greatly. When that happens, there are cracks that form in the ground. We've seen those cracks. Sometimes they can be pretty deep if you put your hand down into them. And typically they're going through the A horizon, through the topsoil, so it can be 4, 6, 8 feet down, even though they wander down through the ground. When those cracks are formed and they stay for some period of time during whatever dry season, parts of the soil tends to crumble and fall down into that. We also have organic material, whether it's grass, leaves, sticks, perhaps burrowing animals, down in those cracks as well. But when the moisture returns, when precipitation returns to the area and it begins to slowly swell, it starts to close. And as those cracks close, they don't quite close the way that they opened, because we've got different material in there, and so pressure is formed. and it builds a lot of pressure and it begins to push, and it pushes outward. It transfers that pressure out and up, and so we get these rises across the surface. Rather than depressions, as I think of them, I tend to think of them, something sinking is actually the high parts that have risen above the surface of the soil. What we get is what we're seeing in the image. I do want to point out too, the middle image, a bit difficult to discern, but on the flatter spaces, we tend to see round gilgi. This is a repeated pattern of kind of small pools, as the word describes, but then on the slopes, we tend to see these long linear gilgi. And this is important because they do channel water, but it's also important to note that they're not caused by erosion. Though these are highly erodible soils, the gilgi actually are not resulting from erosion, but do help to channel water. So a different view of them is this. This was taken in springtime following prescribed fire that removed the vegetation from an area in the preceding fall. So in the spring, we can see some of the winter green on the ground, early spring, I should say, but we can see that these pools have filled with water. And this was taken just last year here in Hunt County, actually early in 2020, I think so I say last spring, February or March. But these pools display kind of a repeated pattern. So it's sometimes described as bomb craters, or looks like the surface of a waffle or a golf ball. You can imagine walking across this or trying to take a wagon across this and how difficult it can be. In many cases, these are 1 and 2 meters across, so maybe 6 feet, possibly a little more than that, and up to the deepest of deep, maybe 2 feet in depth, but typically it's going to be more like 1. They do hold water, though, for a period of time, and it's pretty fascinating to think about how these different things, how the different organisms respond to this. So while they're holding water, we don't see fish up on top of a ridge, of course, but it is basically a micro wetland. They can hold water for long periods of time when the soils are sealed. It slowly percolates through. But between limited evaporation, especially in the cooler season, and the limited ability for water to go back down into the soil, there's nowhere for it to go, and so it simply sits. As the weather warms, this is taken on a cool day, but we begin to see the formation of mosquito colonies, and we see frogs that seem to appear out of nowhere, and they're staying in the soil in between these wet events. But we also have plants that are adapted to these wet conditions, and so we have this micro-community also within this microtopography. So in the wettest of low areas, we have plants displayed that are conditioned to those wet, saturated soils. On the slopes, we see those things that are more common in kind of a in-between area, the mesic zone, that wet and dry. And then up on top, we see the species that are going to be best adapted to dry conditions. But I should point out that this water is tremendous when we think about the landscape. We think about 500,000 acres in Hunt County, or we think about the region at large. Now, these didn't cover all of the blackland prairie ecoregion for a number of different reasons, and soil being, of course, the main part there. But we think about thousands and tens of thousands of acres that would have had this. Can you imagine the water capture that actually was put back in the ground then? It doesn't happen any longer. Now, when we have big rain events, and we know that our precipitation tends to come in almost flash flood events multiple times per year, we see that our water begins to quickly flow across whatever surface, even yards, even residential lawns typically flow that water away. It goes into some storm drain, into the nearest stream, into the river here, the Sabine River, and it's gone. And so we're not keeping much of our water on the ground today compared to what we did 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. So again, I want to point out just the tremendous capacity of this. And this was after a particularly large rain, but all of that captured water has the ability to produce a tremendous amount of vegetation. So there's a lot on the screen I recognize, but we see in our remnant prairies in Hunt County about 300 plant species that do belong here. So that includes everything from some of the trees down to the smallest of little ephemerals, those things that show up for just a couple days and then absolutely disappear. You have to be there just in time to catch them. But we have tremendous biomass production at large. So the above ground vegetation is huge. The below ground vegetation is 3 times as much. The root systems of these plants are huge, and that is tremendously important for a number of different things. Holding the ground together. I'll show you in a moment what some of the root systems can look like. But water retention is tremendously important as well. These systems, of course, they're transpiring, or the plants are respirating and using quite a bit of water. But we still have massive capture with these systems. So structural heterogeneity across the board, with this number of plant species that we're building, we see tall species, short species, graminoids, those grasses. We also have the broadleaf forbs. We are supporting all different types of pollinators, all different types of animals. We've got food out here for everything that belongs here, whether it's still on site or not. These root systems also are reaching deeply into the soil, which allows for drought resistance. When we have these long periods of drought, sometimes for multiple years, as we all know, our native plants do really well. You can come see me any day of the year, no matter what the plant conditions, and I will show you happy green plants, and I can show you something to bloom any day of the year. 40 degrees outside today, but I'm sure I can find something. We also have deep nutrient cycling. So the idea of deeply rooted plants is in part that they're capturing water from deeper, or pulling water from deeper within the soil in those times of droughts when water is more scarce for them, but also they're pulling nutrients from deeper within the soil and bringing that to the surface. It's stored in plant material, so whether it's stems or leaves, and when those plants die or begin to die back, those plants that go dormant at the end of the season, we've got dry vegetation in the surface that begins to biodegrade, and as it breaks down, it releases those nutrients again at the surface. Those nutrients then are at the surface soil and slowly go back into the soil near the surface, so they're available to young plants, those less deeply rooted species, and much more available for the near term for anything that does need it. So we also see nutrient cycling through animal waste when they're eating on site, depositing their waste, and then we see it from fire, which I'll touch on in just a bit. The last thing I want to point out is that the deep roots allow for microchannels, at least temporarily. As those roots live and die, they leave little tubes, little straws that allow for water to dissipate rapidly, or percolate, I should say, down through the soil rapidly before they close. So it is temporary, but it's constantly happening. We also have gas exchange in these, and then we have a number of different microorganisms, both fungal and bacterial, that are living within the soil, and those are tremendously important to our vegetative communities as well. So our root systems looks something like this. And there's a number of different schemes that are available online, but very, very deep. So I understand that we can't see the numbers or the species that are listed, but the bottom number is listed on the left and right side is 15 or 16 feet. And some of these plants are reaching to near that level here in Hunt County, some of the native plants. And there's some interesting things to point out. So next to last, on the right side, is one of our liatris species. It's a gay feather, a blazing star. And it's something that is fairly common through the area in better soil conditions, not just in remnant prairies, but it's something we can still see in parks or sometimes sold in horticulture for use. But it typically in this region, a couple of species that we have are going to be knee-high, maybe waist-high on the big end, but they've got roots that are stretching down 5 times that deep, pushing 15 feet. It's pretty incredible. Through the middle, we've got several different plant species there, including some of our tall grasses, so we can see that they're reaching 8 and 10 feet in root depth. And these, of course, are on the high end when soil conditions allow and so forth. But I want to point out all the way on the far left, we've got really, really short. That is Kentucky bluegrass, which is a POA species. It is something that is used as a turf grass throughout the Great Plains, and we have other species here that also fit this category, including Bermuda. But as you can see, very shallow root system compared to many of our native plants. And so when it is suffering from drought conditions, when it's in soils that are lacking in nutrients, it doesn't have a lot of opportunity to pull from deeper within the soil. Conversely, on the right side, what might be considered our native turf grass, all the way on the far right, is buffalo grass. Buffalo grass on the high end is maybe 12 inches tall. In many cases, it's going to be shorter than that, particularly when it blooms. But yet, we've got deeply rooted grass here, in this case maybe 6 and 8 feet, but it forms a turf and it is available for use in yards. Low water tolerance, or low water requirements, and very tolerant of our wide variety of climatic conditions and changes here in this region. So I'm going to walk through what is typically called the big 4 grasses, but I like to refer to them as the big 5 tall grasses, and I'll tell you why. But typically, the biggest of the big is going to be the big blue stem, the Andropogon gerardii. The gentleman in the picture is well above my head. He's a big 6.5 foot guy. I don't know. What we can see in this case is above his head. In this region, many of those that I see are going to be as tall as me or maybe a little shorter, so between my head and my shoulders in height. But sometimes known as turkeyfoot. This is one of our important tall grasses. It is not something that you see too frequently on roadsides or in old pastures. However, little bluestem, which on the high end can be waist high to chest high in this region, little bluestem is something that does do well in poorer conditions. So the soils that are much more exhausted, have lower nutrient qualities, this is something that does do very well. This is also a bunch grass like big bluestem, great forage, but they're really good for wildlife. They produce a tremendous amount of seed, and they will hold their biomass through the winter, and so they'll be available for whatever animals may find it for forage throughout the dormant season. Next on the list is yellow Indian grass. Yellow Indian grass, when it's blooming, it's going to be as tall as me or even above that. But for the majority of the year, it's probably knee-high, maybe waist-high in really good conditions as a bunch grass. But yet another good forage, very colorful. It's hard to tell in the picture perhaps, but it has bright yellow color when it's truly in flower. And then beyond that, the flower, the inflorescence of the grass will stay open as a kind of a coppery golden color. And this is one that you might see in old fields and old agricultural fields that have gone to pasture, but it is not too common in that case. Every once in a while you get a glimpse of it on a roadside somewhere. Not absolutely rare by any means, but not too common in the old agricultural areas. Okay. Up next we have switchgrass. Switch comes in two forms in this region: a bunch grass, which is visible in the left picture, and then in the middle, a little harder to see. It's going to be more of a colonial species or clonal species, where the plant is actually putting up multiple stems per individual plant. And so we can look at an area that has a number of different stems. But on the right, we're looking at the panicle of its flower or its inflorescence. And it has a big open inflorescence. It looks a lot like Johnson grass. Or maybe Johnson grass looks like switchgrass if you're familiar. When you look at the details up close, they're not too difficult to tell apart, but they both have a robust nature. Particularly the bunch grass version of this, it was adapted naturally into wetter conditions, and so it's going to be found typically in wetter conditions, although if you plant it or spread the seed in drier spaces and upland areas, it does grow really well, but those can be well above my head. Really thick, a lot of biomass, and the single year's growth. Of course, as grasses, they go dormant, they go back to the ground during the winter season and then begin again in the spring. All right. So I add to my presentation as a big five, or the big five, eastern gamagrass. And the reason for this, the eastern gamagrass, particularly in this region, the northern, northeastern blackland prairies, the eastern gamagrass is very prolific. And it's difficult to tell in the image, but bottom left, this is some space where it is completely dominant. And there are a number of different prairie areas where the eastern gamagrass absolutely looks to be the dominant grass. And it is quite important. It puts out a number of seed heads per mature individual. But each of those seed heads, instead of having hundreds of seeds per plant, we tend to see maybe a dozen or 2 dozen per plant per season. So it is not a prolific seeder, but I do see that the viability or the success rate of those seeds tends to be pretty high. Also, it grows in it is a bunch grass, but it grows in almost a circle. And so as it ages through the years, it tends to spread out and become larger. The leaves come up and then fold over naturally. Gravity pulls them down. So we have almost a ring beneath that. And then this open center that develops in the middle. Well, that open center will eventually begin to support other plants. The roots of the gamagrass are still in place, and we can see those rhizomes, which are root storage, kind of like a bank account. We can see those near the surface, but we'll begin to see other plants actually growing in the middle of it. So it's facilitating space for other plants. But then around the edge, we tend to have kind of a bare space around the ring, and beneath that is fantastic for small rodents and young birds that are ground nesting or growing on the ground to kind of learn their way. And for rodents, it is fantastic as a tunnel system to help hide from predators from the air. So really an important grass. Also thought to be one of the predecessors to corn or maize, say a maize. And it looks pretty similar when you look at those seeds. So I'll point out a few other prairie grasses and then go through some forbs as well. Just a few of the common plants. On the left, Florida paspalum is native to this area. Pretty robust, typically in wet areas, and it looks a lot like Dallas grass. Dallas grass is a yard weed, not from Dallas, but named for scientists. But Dallas grass is something that does very, very common in your yard grasses, things Bermuda or otherwise, maybe something we've dealt with. So it may look familiar. Florida paspalum is native. Next, Cytoscramma. This is one that in this region grows to be perhaps knee-high, but it's actually the state grass of Texas. It is found in almost all regions of the state. Grows in drier conditions, and so here we find it in gravelly roadsides. It is planted by the DOT or TxDOT folks, as well as some of the counties when they're doing repairs or seeding areas, but it is also just a very common grass. Once again, it makes a lot of seed. It's good for wildlife for a number of different things, not just seed production, but as a forage. Bushy bluestem on the third panel there is typically found next to wet areas. So we can see in this picture it's adjacent to a pond. Looks a lot like a broom's edge bluestem. And of course they are related. They're in the same genus, but this one is particularly pretty, and typically it's going to show us where a wet space might be found. So if we see it out in the middle of the field, you could expect that at least seasonally that's going to have wet, saturated soil. On the far right is an image of the buffalo grass that I talked about a couple of minutes ago, and that can be used as a turf grass and perhaps as a native grass. It is something that grows, as I said, to be about 12 inches and frequently would be found beneath these other overstory prairie plants. So as bison would come through or following fire, it's one of the first things to respond and can begin to cover an area, assuming that it's present. It will do a pretty good job of covering space and helping to protect the soil for a short term while the other plants recover from disturbance. Some of the forbs, some of the broadleaves that we see on the left, paintbrush. So this is Castellacea purpurea, which is a perennial paintbrush. And the other that's common that we think of as being a roadside paintbrush, we typically call it Texas paintbrush or Indian paintbrush, is a salmon color. It's an annual. This one also in the same genus and of course closely related. The prairie clover in the middle. We've got a number of different dahlia species. This one is orbiculata, I believe, or the white prairie clover. Next we have heath aster, and then the fourth one is the goldenrods, which are solidagos. Both of those, the last two panels are really important. We've just passed that season, but they're late season bloomers, and so they're very important to those pollinators that are moving around at the end of the summer. They are building energy storage for either migratory travels as they move back to the south and or reproductive, final reproduction for the season before reaching their wintering grounds. And we can say that they each build a tremendous amount of flower and therefore the nectar availability to those pollinators is huge. A couple others that I want to run through. The American basket flower on the far left is an annual. It is one that actually responds in prairie areas with an explosive color. That's about the color, and that's about what the full bloom of it is going to look like. It's an aster, so it's actually a composite head with a number of different flowers in that. But as an annual, it responds to late season disturbance, so late growing season. If we see fire or heavy grazing in late summer going into the fall, this is one of the plants that may respond in bulk, and it makes a beautiful color across the landscape. The snow on the prairie is one that we see late in the summer, so we see August, September typically, maybe into October. It has small white flowers, but the leaves turn white, presumably to help draw pollinators to the plant. And so it makes a showy, beautiful color. It is pretty common. It is something that we can see in old agricultural lands, out in pastures. Typically it's not grazed by animals, and so even when the areas are grazed down, we'll still see it standing. Milkweeds fit that as well. We've got probably 6 different milkweeds here in northeast Texas that we can find in Hunt County. Milkweeds most of them are poisonous to livestock, so livestock leave them alone, and they're not very popular amongst agriculturalists, but they are very popular specifically with the monarch butterfly. And the reason for that is the monarch butterfly, while it may feed on the nectar, its caterpillars only feed on plants in the Asclepias genus, in the milkweed group. And so it is absolutely required of the monarch butterfly to complete its life cycle. It does 5 per year as it travels from the northern part of North America all the way down into central Mexico. The last thing that I've got on the list here is rope dodder. And dodder, D-O-D-D-E-R, if you can't read that is a parasitic plant. I just find it fascinating. Happened to catch it in bloom one time. But dodder is something that, as a parasite, is taking its nutrients from other plants, but it is actually not photosynthesizing, and therefore it's not green. If you've ever seen an orange spaghetti-looking covering out in the middle of a field somewhere, that's what you were seeing. And I find it to be pretty fascinating. It will spread out and certainly damaging to the plants and stealing nutrients from, but typically doesn't kill them, and it doesn't take over an area. It's not an invasive species. It is native to the area, but as a parasite, it basically takes over for a period and does what it needs to do for its reproductive cycle, and then it all but disappears. It leaves behind, following the little white flower group that we see here, it leaves behind a kind of a hard, corky growth around the subject plant from whom it's stealing its nutrients. Okay, so just a prairie image. This is taken early summer, I guess probably in May, I don't remember specifically. But despite what you may see in this image, I see a number of different species, not just in bloom, but that are evident to me. A huge variety. This is taken in remnant prairie space. We can see purple echinacea, the tall cone flowers in the kind of in the center part of the picture. Down on the bottom right, we can see milkweeds. In the bottom center, we're seeing phlox. The white spaces kind of across the center are my brain's not asleep, which it does, by the way, once per presentation, so we'll get that out of the way. Well, we'll skip that. If we can jump forward, maybe. Okay. So I want to tell you, we have a few different plant species that we consider indicators. And these are not necessarily indicating that we're looking at remnant prairie specifically, but that we're looking at really good soil and health conditions of a plant community at large. So those that we look at for this specific region here in Hunt County, blue wild indigo is one of those. It is an early bloomer. It comes out in April, produces a big tall purple spike, a number of different flowers, very popular with the early pollinators that are moving through the area. Next on the list is the purple cone flower. We've got several different species, but the one shown here, the Echinacea atrorubens, is particularly rare. It is one that just does not grow well at all in poor soils, and it is, well, each of these actually are plants that tend to disappear when they've been subject to even a single severe soil disturbance. So even a single plowing can push these out. Rattlesnake master, the third one on the list, shown here is in full bloom. It makes a nice little round head, indicative of a golf ball. Has a number of little white flowers on it, but that's about as showy as they get. However, quite popular with a number of different pollinators, and it is typically in full bloom for our region in July, as is the final plant on this list, the compass plant. And this is Silphium laciniatum. It is a very interesting plant. I don't have an image showing here of the leaves, but the leaves can be as long as my arm. They're just huge. They're very rough. They pull silica from the soil or sand particles up through the soil and into the leaves, presumably as a defense against herbivory. But then it makes a number of showy yellow sunflowers. And of course, in the sunflower group of the aster family, but these are 3 or so inch sunflowers on a stalk that's well above my head. These are things that we don't see, all 4 of these, things that we just don't see on roadsides. These are not something that you're going to come across stumbling through a pasture that has been subjected to years of work, one way or another, whether it's old cropland or it's been grazed in recent years or whatever that may be. These are plants that tend to disappear with these impacts. So I understand that here today, talking to the Cotton Museum, preaching to the choir, so to speak, talking about the history of these lands. But in general, settlers came to these areas and really began to stake claim in the 1850s. And following the Civil War, a lot of changes were occurring, including the shift towards large textile production. And so cotton suddenly became a tremendously lucrative endeavor. And it was found that these blackland soils grow cotton very well. Again, preaching to the choir, I recognize. But as this happened, and these lands were converted, it brought money to the area. It also was bringing money at large to the global economy through shipping, through, again, textile industry, but also through technologies. And so technologies were developed to to increase the production rates, both at the textile end of things, at the far end of manufacturing, but also at the production end. So we began to see increased tools that allowed for more rapid conversion of the land, more efficient tilling of the soil or plowing of the space, but also transportation. So I believe here in Hunt County, the railroad first came to Greenville about 1880, and in just a couple of years made a tremendous shift in the number of bales that were put out. It basically doubled between something 1878, 1882, went from 17,000 to roughly 40,000 bales per year coming out of Hunt County, and only increased from there. The Blackland Prairie Eagle region at large was producing more cotton for 50 or 70 years than pretty much anywhere in the world. There's a lot of dispute to be had with parts of the Mississippi River Delta and central Mississippi, but we'll leave that for another day. Some of the things though, that changed with this and this rapid conversion of the land, we can see these gentlemen working hard here with their mechanized tool, but we began to see soils left bare were highly erodible, and it's because of the small clay particles that dominate the soil here. So leaving the soil bare during the time of year when it was not growing plants also left it subject to the weather during the time. That's when we tend to get large flash flood events and a never-ending wind out across these open spaces. Further, the money that was brought into this region at large led to development. So more land was converted not just for cotton production, but then following that and at the same time for urbanization or for development of other infrastructure. So cities were built, little towns were suddenly springing up everywhere, railroads were pushing across different spaces, and it really changed the landscape at large. And this fragmentation is something that we still talk about in conservation today as the leading drive towards changes in plant communities or species safety, so to speak. Land fragmentation obviously leads directly to habitat loss, and so these are tremendous concerns as we're looking backwards. But it is important to point out that the cities and the economies that we have today built on the backs of the cotton production throughout this region. We wouldn't have in Texas or throughout parts of the Great Plains what we do now if it weren't for all of these changes through these years. So this happened relatively rapidly, and it's interesting to think that it took thousands of years to really build what we see in a few spaces today, but it changed very, very rapidly. The good news is that there are people that are looking into this. So to give some numbers for where we are today, as I said earlier, out of 15 million acres, we have far less than 1% that's remaining in what we consider to be intact condition. So it's typically thought to be 5,000 to 7,000. These are the numbers that are given, 5,000 to 7,000 acres of remnant blackland prairie remaining. And I'm here to tell you today that there's definitely more than that. What's important though is that many of these are really small sizes. So we're looking at 5 to 100 acre parcels. Many of them are in terrible condition. They're not functional, they're separate, so they're little islands in a giant sea of converted landscape. And so they're not talking to one another, they're not sharing genetics. Animals of whatever size are confined to them, and especially if they're obligates, if they require those specific plants or plant communities, then they're either trapped there or they can't find enough space. And so these are continuing to be limiting problems. But of the 5,000 to 7,000 that is typically talked about, it may be 5 times that. We may be looking at 30,000 acres across the region, which is a much better number until we compare it again to 15 million. These are shocking numbers. The largest remaining is a little over 2,000 acres. It's in Lamar County, outside of Paris, a little bit west of Paris. It's in private ownership, but it is good condition. It continues to be used for hay production and some cattle grazing. Don't know the future of it, but we like to look at that as a beautiful intact prairie. And it is visible from US Highway 82 near Brookston. The Daphne Prairie is located in Franklin County, so farther to the east. The Daphne Prairie is in private ownership, but it is very well cared for. It's about 900 acres in total of remnant prairie, and then there's some space around that where they've been pushing their natives and enacting restoration efforts. But we see the region is converted, still now is agriculturally producing row crops, at least in some part. We see the usual suspects there, including still some cotton. We see a little bit of ranching across the region, but there are groups that are looking at these protected, or not protected, but these remnant or natural plant communities and spaces and trying to protect those. So that includes the Native Prairies Association of Texas, Texas Land Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, other groups as well. So I'm going to propose a question, and a rhetorical question, a philosophical question, but if these communities have been essentially intact as we see them, these remnants, for thousands of years, they must be a climax community, right? They must be as far as that can naturally go. And that may be true. What we're looking at here is a portion of the Climber Meadow Preserve, but this is a fantastic picture for trying to emulate what early settlers, naturalists, explorers, soldiers described across the Great Plains and especially the Blackland Prairie ecoregion, which is this huge expanse of grass punctuated occasionally by a single large tree with virtually no understory. Well, if this is all that it could be, this is what everything might look like. But that's not quite the case. Things grow into trees, and it grows into trees very well. And so we have to acknowledge that. We have to think about this. While I might tell you that in my regular day job, trees are my enemy, because I work regularly to open space, remove trees, prevent them from growing too large, that's absolutely not the case. They're tremendously important to our ecosystems at large. So the picture at the top is a space that I manage far south of here in Falls County that is succeeding, moving forward to become a woodland. And these spaces are very good at that. We get enough precipitation that the true climax community arguably would be a woodland. That is what these prairie spaces would be, at least in the eastern portion of the Blackland Prairies, if we left them alone. These are some of the tree species that are really common, and particularly here in this area. We see the sugarberry or hackberry. We see cedar elm, honey locust, which is a beautiful thorny thing that nobody seems to like too much. It's good for wildlife for a number of different uses. We also see bodark, which is long-lived, slow-growing tree that makes a very, very hard wood. It's been used for everything from bows and arrows by the Native Americans to wagon wheels and tool handles and plows, all sorts of different things through the years. I have fence posts that are still standing, doing just fine. They've been through countless fires, rainstorms, insects, all of that are 100+ years old. They're doing just fine, supporting wire that's been replaced 2 or 3 times. But we've got a number of other species anyway. On the bottom right, we're looking at open forest. That is probably what a lot of our forest area did look like along the riparian areas for much of the year. Would have limited understory because of frequent fire moving into those areas, but the soils remained wet enough that the fires were lower in intensity, and therefore many of the larger trees didn't succumb to the heat of the fire, but the small herbaceous or shrub understory did. So, okay, we're supporting countless different animals. This is just a tiny, tiny, tiny little fraction. But hundreds of birds, over 100 bird species are used in this region. These are many different things that might be familiar to you. Of course, if you've been in this region for any length of time, our friend the black rat snake in the middle is one that likes to come say hello. But one of my favorites is actually on the bottom left. That's the dick sissel. It is a neotropical migrant. It spends its winters in Central America, but it comes up here and through the Great Plains for the summer. We are its breeding ground, and it prefers the natural native communities, those diverse grassland communities that we find in the Brandon Prairie. So in those spaces we find a much higher density of these birds. They nest roughly knee-high in small brush, which is a reminder that trees are a part of the system, and we must have some of them. But a knee-high tree is much easier to manage for than something that's grown to be huge. But a number of different species representing all the different groups is found here. I want to talk quickly through what built and maintained the Blackland Prairie ecosystem and the Great Plains at large, frankly. This can be expounded to include all of the Great Plains, but climate is a huge driver. As I've said over and over, the precipitation to the east is much wetter and diminishes as we go towards the west. And so in the eastern portion of the United States, we graduate from forest into those tall grasses, then to the midgrass and short grass. So climate is a huge factor. But next on the list is going to be fire. Periodic fire is so important to these systems because they are disturbance maintained. Naturally, fires were ignited by lightning and then later, and arguably all the way through, by humans, the Native Americans, and then for many different purposes, the settlers following that were using fire for different things. So clearing landscapes is a part of it, but the Native Americans understood that burning space this year would give a green regrowth that would then draw animals for next year. So they used it for those purposes. Arguably, that is hunting or livestock management. Further, they were using it to push animals at different times. It was a great way to get animals to go, to herd animals to go where you wanted them to go. Primarily in the Great Plains, that would have been done until just a couple hundred years ago when horses returned. That would have been done on foot, and so very difficult to herd a number of bison that didn't really want to do anything that you asked them to when you don't have a means of transportation. And so we do get to these guys. The grazing across the board deserves so much credit for the construction and maintenance of the prairie system, or the grassland systems through the Great Plains. Bison get the majority of the credit, but any of the herbaceous or herbivore ungulates, those hoofed animals, deserve a lot of credit, and especially those that were moving around in any sizable herd, because they would have had the biggest impact. This picture was taken in northern Oklahoma last year, year before last, on a big grassland preserve that still has bison, still has space for them. This is not something we see typically in this region. It's something that we'd love to have back on our landscape, even in small numbers, but they're difficult to manage for. Many of our neighbors much more interested in cattle, much better infrastructure in place for dealing with them. But if you can imagine looking at this picture with a herd of animals, it might have been hundreds or even thousands, as they're frequently reported in the literature, we can imagine the amount of damage that they would have done in a short period of time. And so much like fire, they would have come in and basically taken all the surface vegetation away in a relatively short amount of time, in just a couple of days. And they also would have stirred up mud, moved seeds around, and left a lot of waste behind. So, albeit a giant mess when they walked away, but this is a fantastic system for starting over. It's a big reset button. Again, much like fire. So when we break it down, we can look at on the left prescribed fire and grazing as those natural managers for the system. On the right is maybe how we handle this in a more modern way when we have limited options for using as tools on the left. So mechanical is a good surrogate for grazing. And in place of grazing animals in many cases, although we do use those for management of our prairies, we are either hay cutting or simply shredding one way or another. And then further, we're cutting those trees or individual species that are problematic for one reason or another. Brush encroachment, always a big issue. Fire helps to set that back, but in the absence, we go after some of these things with mechanical tools. And then chemical is, well, I'll touch on some more of the details in a moment, but it is a tool that works really well, but it comes with side effects, so to speak. So we're familiar with some of those, but it's an important thing to consider. And then restoration, which maybe was a natural system a long time ago, but now we're jump-starting that, so to speak. And so we can go into old pastures, spaces that are recognized as having a reasonably intact soil system primarily, and begin to put natives back in place and try and restart the system that way. A couple things I'll point out, though, that across the board, these systems are maintained by humans. It requires active management, not necessarily every day, but some sort of inputs basically every year, at least consideration. And every couple of years, we need a frequency of large disturbance. And then I want to point out, too, that my overall philosophy is simply that emulating or imitating those natural processes, fire and grazing, by whichever means we choose or have at our disposal, we are recreating or trying to recreate the natural system in the way that it maintained historically. Okay, so we use prescribed fire. This is something that is done on a limited basis. I'd like to see a lot more of it on the landscape. On the left, we can see an operator. We're working under strict conditions, strict guidelines, I should say. So this person is outfitted in safety equipment from head to toe. I believe it's a female, I don't remember, but wearing Nomex clothing. It is generally fire resistant. They're carrying a safety a shelter, is actually what we refer to it as. It's not something that we typically expect to need in a grassland, but this is something that can save a firefighter's life. We're using trained firefighters for these jobs, but then following strict safety protocols. Where the person is standing is in a mode fire break. It's better visible on the right side. The picture on the right was taken in October at the Park Hill Prairie, which is in Collin County, northeastern Collin County on the edge of Hunt County. We burned, I don't know, 100 acres. The Nature Conservancy's been helping to manage the grassland portion of the park where they have a 50-acre remnant and several 25-acre restoration spaces. And so we burned the majority of that. But we can see in this image that we've got a mowed line that basically allows for control of the fire. So we can send the fire in the direction we want it to go while maintaining easy or relatively easy control with the staff. What we don't see in the image is the dozen people and huge amount of equipment that was used to do this. But we can see where this large tree is on the right side, perhaps you can see that there's still standing vegetation. So this line was designated to go through there for one reason or another, and on the other side we've still got standing vegetation. What we don't have in these systems is the variety of fire conditions that historically happened in this region. First and foremost, there's a limitation, so we have lines. That means, for one thing, that all of the property, the subject property, is not being burned. If I have to cut a fire break through it, then I'm not able to burn the space where the firefighter is standing. But we're not burning kind of at large, regionally. We're doing this in controlled spaces under controlled conditions. Secondly, though, we're doing it in periods where we are able to control the fire safely. And this is important to note. If we think historically, especially those naturally ignited fires by lightning, they would have happened most likely in the driest of seasons or driest of conditions. So hot, dry summertime, think August for North Texas, when there's no moisture in the fuel, in the grasses and plants, no moisture in the air, and then there's a pop-up thunderstorm. That's when things would actually burn. There may be lightning strikes that ignite fires in February or in May, but they don't burn very far because they're followed by water, by rain. And of course, we don't know about a lot of those because fire suppression. We have fantastic firefighters across the board that respond quickly. So it is simply a different landscape, but it is still being done. So a couple of things I want to point out, though. More fire on the landscape is one of my goals. Safe, again, under guidelines and under controlled conditions. But this is in the city of Frisco this year. So at the start of COVID, just at the start, in February, the city of Frisco, with their progressive natural resource team in their parks department, they actually got fire on the ground. And we can see in the background, that is El Dorado Parkway. This is on the south side of that, which means with the south wind that we typically have, even the smoke was moving across a 6-lane road, and the city was able to find ways to make this work. And so, very excited about it. This is maybe 6 acres, 5 acres, but it's progress. Even better, though, the city of Frisco did it a second time this fall. So, despite COVID or anything else in 2020, they've done this 2 times in city parks. This was done also, I think, in February, January, February. This is on the shores of Lake Lavon at the Blackland Prairie Raptor Center, which is a bird rehabilitation site. It is open to the public on a limited basis. There's a website, so you can check that out to figure out exactly when, but they're working on prairie restoration as well, grassland restoration. And this is the fire conducted by a mixed group of local firefighters. They used it as a training exercise, of course following guidelines and under those strict conditions, but it has been successful on every different side. So we have firefighters that are getting further training, but they are now emissaries that are helping to spread the word in a different way about the biological benefits of prescribed fire or fire in the landscape. Also, the improvement to this land, I actually spoke with the grassland manager of the site yesterday on the phone, and she was telling me just how good it's done. I haven't been to visit, so I'll be doing that very soon. But she's very excited, and she'll be doing more over the winter on the same site using the same team, and I'm excited to see that. So mechanical is another component. Fire is not the end-all be-all. It is fun. It's fun to talk about, and it always grabs attention. But in the absence of that, and in the absence of animals, for small spaces, city parks, or landowners that simply don't or aren't interested in owning animals, mechanical is the way to go. And so there's a number of different ways that this can be done. There's so many different tools that can be used, and we're going for individual plants as well as big, broad space. But generally, the way to look at this is that smaller tools take a lot more energy, effort, cost, but they have a smaller impact. Larger tools have a larger impact. And so we have to find the balance of what our objectives are, what is reachable, and of course, what our budgets allow for. And so the next on the list is going to be our chemical. Chemical is safe, and it's relatively easy, and it's cheap and relatively easy. The question of safety is always there. So safety to the operator is primary, but also safety to soil, to downstream unintended targets, to broad targets in the immediate area. So it can be hard on wildlife. It can be, it can stay in the soil depending on use. Many people are not properly applying, not necessarily using all the safety equipment necessary, and so we run into danger. This is something that can affect all of us. What your neighbors are doing, or even farther upstream, impactful. And so this is something that is really concerning. Pollinators in particular, many of our plants can be affected as unintended targets, but pollinators especially are susceptible, as are amphibians. So here's a gray hair streak that is easily affected by herbicide. There's a number of different techniques that can be used, but the smaller the technique, the smaller the impact, so to speak. So it's the best way to go. And then I've touched on restoration, but to give just a broad overview, the idea is restarting the native plant communities in those spaces that have been converted one way or another. And this is happening at all different levels. There are folks that are putting prairie plants or native plants into their gardens and beginning to focus on that, and then spreading that outward. There are small-scale restoration projects that are happening that are anywhere from half an acre to 5 to 10 acres. And I do those annually, where I'm trying to kind of upgrade some of my spaces that are not remnant prairie, but the surrounding buffer lands are doing. But then there are some large-scale projects, in particular one that is particularly interesting to me anyway, up on the Red River. Just this, on the southern side of the Red River, there's 17,000 acre ranch, something like that, that is undergoing restoration as part of the mitigation for the new surface reservoir that's being built as a water supply for the region. So the offset there is this ranch and the restoration efforts there. They're doing grassland restoration, but they're also doing a lot of other things, including hydrologic reformation, where they're actually correcting problems that have occurred through decades, many decades, to the hydrology of the immediate area. So they're building forests, they're building all sorts of different things. But the way that we do this, in short, to look at it simply, is that we take away the vegetation that's present, kind of prepare the soil, and then put new vegetation, put new seed down. And it sounds simple. It's a lot like gardening on a very big scale. But the problem is, those things that are already present are frequently very pervasive. The exotic species, or those few, whatever's they are, native, weedy, whatever the term we want to use, they're particularly pervasive, they're strong. Those are the survivors that are in place, and we need to recognize that, and it can be difficult to get them out. And even more difficult is when we start to get really good things growing and still have the bad stuff present. Suddenly we don't have an easy way to manage for that. So in this image, it may be difficult to discern, but we're looking at just a few species as being particularly evident. Those purple dots, that's a ringo, it's an annual. It's something that showed up pretty easily, so we get those early species, the annuals or weedies, show up. But then the other thing that happened in this image, this restoration effort, is Indian grass, which is great. One of our tall grasses, beautiful, native, awesome, except that I got a huge supply of that, and then a little bit of annual, and nothing else. So the results of these efforts are difficult to predict and can be slow. Success can be slow. So we do all of this work, and then frequently we're just waiting. We wait for more, and if we have the resources, then we put some more into it. But in most cases, we just have to wait. So I've got a few different prairie pictures to walk us through the year of what some of the prairies may look like. So this is in early spring in 2019. It was a stormy day. As you might imagine, shortly after the photo was taken, we had to run for cover. But it made for a beautiful picture where we're looking at the prairie larkspur, which is the white guy that I forgot earlier, as well as the purple echinacea. This is a similar area later in the year, so probably going into May, where we're looking at the primary image, color that shows is the purple. That's the American basket flower that I described earlier. But it is, as the prairies are beginning to come alive for the early summer, we're seeing some annual grasses in there and then some other things going into color. This is actually taken in either September or October of this year, but this is late summer blooming. So again, we're seeing a whole different set of colors and species that are expressing themselves, but it also shows the biodiversity, the number of species present in a relatively small area. We can see the height of these. So admittedly, I certainly put my camera down a little lower in the grass, but this is dense. This is hard to walk through. This is unimaginable to carry or to cut with any kind of small machine, but it is also gorgeous. It smells wonderful. It's full of life. Those things that bite you and poke you are in there too, but just as well are all of the things that are attractive to the eye and to the scent. Uh-oh. So, if you push the wrong button, what happens? Can you help me? There we go. So don't do that again. Okay. So stepping forward, we've got a number of different groups. I mentioned a couple earlier that are working on these types of projects, whether it's restoration or protection. Protection takes a number of different forms. But at the top left, we've got agencies, state or federal agencies. We've got those on the top right that are in place really to help small landowners, like the NRCS or Texas AgriLife. They've got a number of different programs and groups even. But then we've got some of the nonprofits that are doing land protection actively on the ground, on their own lands, as well as helping those around. Then we've got things research-based, like Caesar Kleberg Institute out of Texas A&M at Kingsville, which is doing research across the state on many different things, including prairie species, or Texas AgriLife, which is doing, again, a lot of different research, including on blackland prairie. But then we've got some of the municipalities, so cities, local cities, Fort Worth, Plano, Frisco, Dallas, but a lot of the other suburbs as well. All of these come together in so many different forms, but trying to educate through outreach is tremendously important. So with that, I will point out that we have a number of different places where we can visit these remnant prairies. We can actually get out and see these. And so I encourage you, I'll be happy to share this list, and this is by no means comprehensive. This is a good starter list. But the Paul Matthews Prairies, first thing on the list, on the top left, Paul Matthews Prairie is in Hunt County. It is north of the little town of Floyd. It is a remnant prairie, 100 acres, that is absolutely protected. In fact, it is protected by two different organizations that work together to ensure that it will be protected permanently, but it is also in an area that is rapidly growing, and so we will be seeing changes around that. And I encourage people to visit and come to know some of these spaces so that you can understand why they're important to us, but then important to you and important to all of us together. Many different spaces that can be visited. Another summer scene, this is probably in June, early summer, here in Hunt County, and just another example of what an expansive, tangled color can look like. With that, I would point out that I typically do a number of different events. This year, well, we know how that's turned out. I hope to be on track this next year, but the Climber Meadow Preserve, where my office is located, is outside of Celeste, here in Hunt County. We're not open to the public on a daily basis, but there are opportunities at different times of the year under normal years anyway, to come out and visit. We do tours across the prairie. I do a number of different educational visits and tours. We're also hosting research. We act as a reference site. Many different things are ongoing. The preserve in total is about 1,400 acres just at that site. And of that, we have about 750 acres of remnant prairie. It is one of the largest bands or sections of known remnant prairie, but on vertisol soil, it appears to be the largest. The Nature Conservancy owns about 625 acres of that, and we manage a little more, and then there's one other neighbor that we have a great relationship with, but don't manage their land for them. But at large, we've got some other buffer space around it. We're doing restoration work, and then we have our own form of agriculture, you might say, where we're growing some plants for seed collection, and then we're doing seed harvesting out along the prairie spaces. But we also have wetlands, woodlands, and lower drainages where we've got riparian conditions as well. So managing for some of everything. And with that, I'll give you one last photo with the opportunity for questions. It's a lot of information.
All right, well, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad you could come. Wish we could have had a few more people, but
That's okay.
more people online will see it. I want to thank you all for coming today. And remember, in January, we don't do a program. Make sure to stop by. We just opened our Christmas exhibits up, so make sure to stop by and see that. And thank you all. See you next year.
Thanks, Susie.